Since October the 7th, 2023, as it relates to the Israel and Hamas matter in the Gaza Strip. Now, recent developments essentially necessitate the discussions of today. We know that everybody is currently on holiday, and however, the importance of these discussions cannot be underestimated. And I hope that I'm audible. Am I audible? Venny, can you confirm that I'm audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you very much. Now, one current recent development is the application by the Republic or the government of South Africa to institute proceedings at the International Court of Justice against the State of Israel. And I thought it very important just to set a background in terms of this application. Essentially, the application concerns acts of threatened or adopted, condoned, taken, or been taken by the government and the military of the State of Israel against the Palestinian people, a distinct national, racial, and ethnic group in the wake of the attacks on Israel on the 7th of October 2023. Now, we know that the government of South Africa has been unequivocally clear that it condemns all violations of international law by all parties, including the direct targeting of Israeli civilians and other nationals, and the hostage taking by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. But I want to take an opportunity to just shed some background in terms of the fact that South Africa relies on in its application. I will just want to give a statistical picture or background before I can invite Prof. Angelo Dube to join us in the discussion. And I will then facilitate the discussion. So it will be a question and answer session from myself to the Prof. And then at the end of our session, I will then ensure that we open the floor for everybody that is interested to engage with the professor or myself on any of the issues that we are going to deal with. Now, it reads as follows. The facts relied on by South Africa in the application and to be further developed in these proceedings established against the background of apartheid, exclusion, ethnic cleansing, annexation, occupation, discrimination, and the ongoing denial of the Palestinian people self-determination. Israel, since the 7th of October 2023, in particular, has failed to prevent genocide and has failed to prosecute the direct and public incitement to genocide. More gravely still, Israel has engaged in and is engaging in and risks further engaging in genocidal acts against the Palestinian people. Those acts include killing them, causing them serious mental and bodily harm, deliberately inflicting on them conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction as a group. Repeated statements by Israeli state representatives, including at the highest level by the Israeli president, the prime minister, and the minister of defense, express genocidal intent. That intent is properly to be referred from the nature and the conduct of the Israeli operation in Gaza. Now, one thing that's very important also is that we must be very clear that there has been a bombardment of Gaza for the past 11 weeks. And we know that Gaza is one of the most populated areas or places in the world. We have over 1.9 million people, and over 85% of the population of Gaza have been displaced from their homes, and we have inadequate shelter, and there are many that are being attacked, killed, and harmed as a result. There has been an excess of over 21,000 Palestinians, including over 7,700 children that have been killed in that war, and many, many others that have been injured.
Stop buying cool stuff. You're broke.
So, having said that, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to then take this opportunity to invite Prof. Angelo Dube to the floor so that we can have the one-on-one discussion. Prof. Dube, welcome, sir.
Thank you, advocates. Try and unmute my camera. I hope the meeting conditions are great and you can see me. I will ask all our colleagues to actually mute themselves so that we don't have feedback when we speak. So if there's anyone with a mic that's not muted, apart from the speaker, please go ahead and mute yourself so we can have a bit of silence in the background. Thank you everyone for coming through. We know this is the holiday season and people are with their family, people are relaxing, but you honored the invitation to come and be with us tonight as we tackle this important development on the global stage, the use of international law to guarantee international peace at the international level. We really, really appreciate your presence in this space. Advocates, thank you for the background that you have given. Unfortunately, when you posed the question to me, we still had a lot of feedback from the microphones that were not muted. I couldn't get what the question was. If you could be kind enough to just quickly rephrase that particular question, then I can handle it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Allow me to just request in advance that I'm going to switch off my camera just to ensure that we are able to hear each other and to ensure that the bandwidth is managed properly. Prof, the first question is this, and I think it always excites me when I see a government engaged in geopolitics. I'd like to understand, Prof, what is the obsession of the South African government with Israel?
Let me unmute. Thank you for the question, advocate. Look, it might be the word used is the obsession of the government with the state of Israel. It might look like indeed there is an obsession, but there isn't necessarily an obsession per se. I think what the state of South Africa is doing is simple to say, I am a member of the international community, a member of the United Nations, and as such, I have obligations which I am bound both by treaty law and by international customary law to uphold and to ensure that they are upheld by anyone who deals or who calls themselves a state on the globe. So South Africa is simply saying, I am a state, I am bound. I am not a law unto myself. I have obligations to ensure that there's international peace. I have obligations to ensure that other members of the UN, other members of the multilateral system, and other members of the international community who fall under customary international law also honor and follow their customary international law obligations as well as their treaty law obligations as such. So South Africa finds itself involved in the situation in Gaza because, for instance, you cannot say, because South Africa is at the southern tip of Africa and Israel is at the uppermost tip of Africa, therefore the two are not related. we have a lot of our citizens living across the globe. And as a state, we have an obligation and an interest in ensuring that their welfare, their rights are observed, their rights are protected, and they're not violated. There are many South African citizens abroad, including in the state of Israel. There are many South African citizens who are, whether legally or illegally, participating in the hostilities that are going on right now in Gaza. South Africa, therefore, has an interest in this particular matter. And when you look at the fact that South Africa is a member of the African Union, a union of all African countries which come together to look at how to move the continent forward, the fact that South Africa, or the fact that the African Union itself has had to deal with an application from Israel not so long ago, where Israel wanted to have observer status before the African Union. Israel itself wanted to have an interest in African affairs. In other words, it wanted to become an observer organization within or an observer entity within the AU system. So if Israel is interested in African affairs, then Africa must be interested in Israeli affairs. So
exactly.
The same interest that Israel had in African affairs is the same interest that African countries must have in Israeli affairs. I hope I've cleared that context and have painted it as clearly as possible.
No, you certainly did a very sterling job, Prof. Prof, thank you very much for that. I think ordinary citizens in this country would appreciate that response. But Prof, there are many people that perhaps are on the platform today and that don't really have an understanding of what's happening in Gaza at the moment. Could you perhaps paint a historical context and current context in terms of what is actually taking place in Gaza today as we speak?
Thank you, Advocate. Just a moment. I'm trying to get something brought into the studio here for my background. The context, I think, is pretty much, we can take judicial notice of what is happening in Gaza. We have seen the state of Israel come into being not so long from today, by simply having some people move into a particular territory and then being recognized as the occupants of that territory. But unfortunately, what that did was to ensure that in a territory that was previously in the possession of the people of Gaza, the people that we call today Palestinians, they now found themselves under a regime that was now occupying their territory. And that has been the case for quite some time now. Whereas not so many decades, just under 100 years ago, this was not a reality. But today we're sitting with a reality where there are contestations over the same piece of land. And we can go back and forth on how land is acquired in international law, whether conquest is still regarded as a suitable means and method of acquiring property. But that is neither here nor there. The bottom line is that people occupied or people possessed and enjoyed a particular territory. And at some point, those people now found themselves having to share initially that particular property or territory with others who had just come in. And at some point, they found themselves having to be dominated and placed underneath those who had come over them in the possession and enjoyment of that particular territory. So that has led to the context, to the conflict that we see today playing itself out in the Gaza situation.
Thank you very much, Prof. That is much helpful. Prof, there is this earlier referral by the government to the ICC. Could you just touch base on that in terms of what is this institution and what was the government pursuing in that instance? And then now the next question thereafter is now, what about this current forum, which is the International Court of Justice? And then what is the government now trying to, what is it chasing now, different from what it failed to achieve in the ICC situation or scenario?
Wonderful. Thanks, Advocate. The initial matter, you will remember that me and you were trying to unpack these very same issues to one TV station not so long ago. The issue involving the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Look, the fact that we're today dealing with two parallel systems that are running together shows you the beauty and versatility of the international criminal justice system and what platforms we have at the international level to try and hold perpetrators of international crimes accountable. When South Africa began with its referral to the ICC, the International Criminal Court established by the Rome Statute, it was simply saying there are allegations of violations of the laws of war. There are allegations of violations of international law, including international customary law. There is a system or a platform that was established by the countries of the world coming together to say, we saw this type of lawlessness under the leadership of Hitler about 50, 60, 70 years ago, and we don't want this to happen again. We are therefore coming together to create a permanent global criminal court to deal with the delinquents who do not see value in human lives, who do not see the sanctity of human life. That is the ICC, the International Criminal Court. When South Africa referred the matter there, it was simply invoking that process because, as you know, Israel is not a party to the Rome Statute. Palestine, on the other hand, has filed a section, an Article 12 declaration to the ICC to say, I, Palestine, recognize the authority of this court in as far as issues taking place on Palestinian territory. So Palestine has accepted the authority of the court to determine criminality that happens on its territory. So South Africa was basically using that international platform to try and ensure justice, to try and ensure accountability for war crimes, accountability for international crimes at the international level. Why is it important that South Africa was the one that referred this matter there? The International Court could not, meromotu, that is of its own accord, take the matter into account because of the Israeli problem, the fact that Israel is not a party to the ICC. And then we also could not invoke the referral powers of the United Nations Security Council. Why can't we invoke those powers? Because at the Security Council, there is what we call the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council: Russia, China, US, France, United Kingdom. They are members for life. Not only are they members for life, they have what is called a veto power. In other words, if something has to be decided upon by the Security Council, including the referral, if any of these countries decides not to vote or not to support that vote, that acts as a veto power. It kills everything. In other words, you need all 5 to agree. Let us send Israel to the ICC. If one of them refuses, even if all the other 190-something countries of the world are of the view that Israel must be sent to the ICC, that will not happen. 5 guys, 5 big boys will determine the state of international criminal justice in the world. That is the P5, the permanent 5 members of the ICC. So we could not then get a referral through the Security Council. We could not get the court itself of its own accord to be seized of the matter. It then required a state party to the Rome Statute, which is South Africa, to say, I'm a state party. I have seen international law being violated. Please, I'm referring this matter to you. Investigate and take over the matter and prosecute those responsible. So that's what the ICC process was about. Why are we now running with the ICJ, you may ask?
That's what I'm interested in, Prof.
Yes,
that's what I'm interested in.
Wonderful. The ICJ, otherwise known as the International Court of Justice, deals with interstate disputes. In other words, South Africa has a dispute with Lesotho, and they can then sue each other at the International Court of Justice, state to state. It has nothing to do with individuals. But South Africa, being a member of the United Nations, being a member of the Rome Statute, being a member of the Genocide Convention, saw that there is something brewing in the Gaza Strip. There are perhaps some genocidal occurrences happening there. There is some form of genocide happening there, or at least there are allegations of genocide which need to be proven that are happening there. that are being perpetrated by the state of Israel. The state of Israel has obligations under the Genocide Convention. It also has obligations under customary international law. Number one, to prevent genocide. Number two, to punish those who perpetrate genocide if they are, sorry, I'm just gonna mute one of the people here. So to prevent genocide and to punish perpetrators of genocide, so long as they are Israeli nationals and can be found within the Israeli, within the reach of the Israeli legal system. So South Africa then says, Israel, with these obligations that you have, we are going to have to sue in order for the International Court of Justice to make a declaration that indeed you have violated your treaty law obligations and your customary obligations. You were supposed to prevent genocide from happening, and you did not. You were supposed to punish those who perpetrate genocide, and you did not. So that is why we are now the ICJ, a state holding another state accountable in order to protect fundamental rights, because the violation of those fundamental rights goes against the obligations that states have agreed upon, either under treaty law or under customary international law.
Correct, Prof. No, thank you very much, Prof, for that. Prof, could you kindly take us to understand what is this genocide? Because I'm sure there's a lot of people in the platform that have joined that don't even have an understanding of what genocide is and what South Africa means when it talks about genocidal character. If you could please elaborate so that all members on the platform and those that would, get the recorded version are able to clearly understand what is it that South Africa is complaining about.
All right. No, thank you. Thank you so much, Advocate. When you look at how genocide is defined, genocide is a crime that consists of certain subsets of crimes or certain actions which either singularly or together, when committed in a particular context, will amount to genocide. For instance, for you to actually commit genocide, you must commit any of the following acts, and you must commit them with intent to destroy. So in your mind, when you start acting out, you must intend to destroy entirely or partially a national, an ethnical, a racial, or a religious group. So those four elements, either you say, I hate Christians, therefore I'm going to start killing Christians. That would be genocide because you have the intention to destroy them totally or partially. Or you say, I hate black people, therefore I'm going to start killing them. So that's a racial hatred. Or you say, I hate nationals of DRC, I'm going to start killing them. So you have a national hatred towards a national group. Or it could be an ethnic group. In the context of South Africa, you could say, I hate, let me not stock conflict. What can I use? In the context of South Africa, let's just say, I hate petty people. Let's just kill all petty people. You're not being ethnic in your hatred. So that, if you carry out that hatred, you harbor the intention to destroy all petty people, either fully or in part. And you hate them simply because of their racial grouping, simply because of their ethnic grouping or their religious grouping, then you're committing the crime of genocide. So the crime of genocide could involve crimes such as killing members of that group. You see a person, you kill them. You see a Khoisan person, you kill them. Simply because they belong to an ethnic group or a racial group, then you're committing that particular crime called genocide. Or you could be causing serious bodily harm, as we have seen happening in the conflict in Gaza.
Prof, if you could just hold on a minute. Just a call from my side to all of the members on the platform. Could we just please mute ourselves so that there's no interference? I apologize, Prof. Please continue, sir.
Wonderful. Thank you. So the other element would be to cause grievous bodily harm. For instance, you simply go to a school, you start bombing the school. It's a school. Children are going to school there. Why are you causing harm with shells and mortar and everything in a school? where learners now come up with their skin scalded because they have been bent by what you threw at them in this conflict. So you're causing grievous bodily harm or deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction. You create a situation where these people are going to live like subhumans, difficult physical conditions of existence, where you determine that on this street or on this particular settlement, only Palestinians can stay there. They can't venture outside this particular perimeter. And you are limiting their human dignity. You are limiting the way they, or the extent to which they can enjoy their humanity. You are inflicting upon them conditions of existence which are degrading and will not allow them to fully embrace or fully or to become or to enjoy their humanity in their fullness. So that would amount to the crime of genocide. Or you could impose measures which are intended to prevent death within the group. We know that in some instances, some genocidal elements would actually cause sterilization of the particular group, to say we're sterilizing all the males or all the females so that they don't give birth to others like them because we hate them so much. Or you could simply prohibit intermarriage between a particular racial group and another group as part of, orchestrating genocide. Or you could forcibly transfer children from the group to another. For instance, you instruct your soldiers to say, when you find a Palestinian child, take them, assimilate them, and make them become Jewish, make them forget who they were. That is part of genocide. I'm just listing the elements of genocide to say you can commit genocide in any of these particular actions or omissions.
Correct, Prof. No, because it was very interesting, Prof, hearing some of the views of, Palestinian leaders, the president, the prime minister, and I think I think one was the minister of security. And
so I don't want to bore you, so I'm going to leave
actually,
so I can listen.
To suggest that essentially anybody that either supports, sympathizes with, is perceived to be a terrorist who must be treated in the same manner. And I was checking now how 2,000-pound bombs are thrown into an area, how certain areas are bombarded completely. And it's crazy what's happening there, Prof. And I think the government is doing a very good job to try and intervene in this space. But Prof, it begs a question which I think has been asked predominantly, and I think in previous discussions we had this question, but South Africa is hypocritical, and in that it deals with the question of Israel in a different way than it deals with the issues of Ukraine and Russia. Could you touch on the allegations of hypocrisy of our government in as far as its actions or stance on Israel is concerned, Prof?
Thank you, Advocate. Look, I'm going to start with one word, national interest. I'm going to come back to it later. For now, I'm just dropping it in there.
No problem.
When one looks at international law, if there's any scholar of international law in this gathering, they will agree with me. At some point, they had to deal with, in their studies towards international law, they had to deal with the question, is international law? Because of situations like this, that question arises. It's part of the learning of international law. Every university will, at some point, try and interrogate the minds of its learners by posing that question: is international law? That having been said, when one looks at how the international legal system was born and how it has developed over the years, you will realize that at some point there was a fella called Hitler. That fella terrorized today's perpetrators of violence. The people who are today brought before the ICC and the ICJ and accused of peddling violence in the Middle East were themselves, violated by a fella called Hitler back in the day. To this day, we're still reminded of that. There are monuments everywhere. As a result, you can't even speak freely of those issues. But that's beside the point. When that began to happen, the global sentiment on whether that was justice on whether that was legal or not was very varied and diverse. There are people who accuse the international legal system of being selective. Selectivity has always been part of the system. Does that render the system illegitimate? No. It is the nature of international politics. It is the nature of international law. From the moment that Hitler and his counterparts were brought before the trials in Nuremberg, in all those military tribunals back in the day in Tokyo and so forth, people call that victor's justice, especially because prior to them being brought before those courts, there was no law prohibiting those particular conduct. So people say this is not justice, it is victor's justice. In other words, it is the punishment of those who failed to win the war by those who won the war. That has characterized, the nature of international criminal justice up to this day, that it is selective in nature. However, if we were to look at the selectivity and then denounce any actions taken because they are selective, we would be failing to understand that for the ordinary child in Gaza whose father left the house going to work and never came back, for the ordinary child in a Gaza school who was sitting there waiting for their mother to pick them up and they never saw their mother because the school ceased to exist because of a bomb blast, that is not a question that we should be asking. We should be asking ourselves, is there someone trying to do justice for those who are voiceless? Is there someone trying to ensure that, because the difference between the Hitler atrocities and the atrocities we see now is that during the Hitler regime, the laws were not there. That's why they had to try and rely on the law of nature. They had to create a fictional legal system to refer to say, but it's abhorrent and so forth and so forth. But today we have the laws. Humanity have spoken for the past 60 years, the past 70 years. They have actually converted these laws from treaty laws into customary international law. The laws exist. When Israel or any other actor acts in a particular way, they know the law and they know they are breaking the law. So the selectivity, as I said in the beginning, will in a very big way be influenced by what we call the national interest. Countries will ask themselves, what is in my interest as a country, as a republic, to intervene in this matter? I've seen genocide happening. Why should I intervene? Why does it affect South Africa? And I said in my opening statement that South Africa has citizens all over the world. And South Africa as a country has both constitutional obligations and international law obligations to ensure the safety and welfare of those citizens. Number two, South Africa belongs to the African Union. It has obligations to promote peace and prevent violence. South Africa belongs to the United Nations. It has obligations there under the UN Charter to promote peace and to distance itself from the conduct of international relations using force. It is simply trying to ensure that its counterpart, called Israel, is indeed upholding the obligations it has under number one, the United Nations Charter. But fourthly, Israel, not so long ago, wanted to be recognized as having a status under the AU. If Israel wants the African Union to recognize it as an observer status, then Israel must be okay with African countries upholding the rule of law in Israel. But before we go back, Advocate, there is an issue I wanted to touch on, which I'm unfortunately forgetting now, but I will get there. The other issue is that not only are we dealing with the conflict in Israel, you know that as a republic, we've come through a lot of things. We've come from apartheid, where we were separated, black people, white people, and the UN was clear that this is an international crime. And besides the conflict going on in Israel, Israel is also a peddler of the international crime of apartheid. In other words, there are streets where, as a Palestinian, you would not dare set foot there. Just like we had benches written white only in South Africa and separate toilets for blacks and so forth. Israel does that to this day, which is a violation of international law. But the point I wanted to raise was this. All these obligations, whether they're under customary law or under the Rome Statute or under the UN Charter, all these obligations, they they force or they place an obligation on the state of Israel to punish perpetrators of the crimes that are happening. You will know that when we came up with the crime called the universal jurisdiction, so it's not a crime, it's a jurisdictional link called universal jurisdiction. It was simply because the perpetrators of the crimes listed under that jurisdictional factor are considered enemies of humankind, otherwise known as hostis humani generis. In other words, if you commit genocide, if you commit crimes against humanity, if you commit war crimes, you are considered an enemy of humankind. You've offended the whole of humanity. So every country has a right and a duty to apprehend you and to prosecute you. We don't care where you committed the crime. You might not have killed any South African. You might not have committed the crime in South Africa. But South Africa has a right to find you and prosecute you because you've offended humanity as a whole. We would not have named such perpetrators hostis humani generis, in other words, enemies of humankind, if the crimes they were committing were not posing a threat to global peace. So that is why we see these interventions today. Thank you.
Correct, Prof. No, Prof, there's another issue, a thought that comes to my mind, and just coming closer to home with the Rwanda genocide, especially against those that are complaining about the actions that South Africa is taking. I mean, we are 20-something thousand people that have died, Palestinians. And should we maybe wait to get to 1 million people that are going to die for us to intervene? And secondly, maybe you would want to take a bite on the concept of the responsibility to protect, R2P. If you can maybe touch on that as well, to edify already the points that you made earlier.
All right. Look, if you look at the fact that we've had genocides in Africa, some documented, some not, some officially avowed, some officially disavowed. We've seen what Belgium was doing in the Congo, whatever they would want to call it today, but we've seen a lot of genocidal massacres happening there way back in the day. And then again, if you come back closer in recent years, you will see the genocide in Rwanda. And if you look at the genocidal intent here, how the Israeli government is characterizing the people involved, or the people that are victims, how they will fight as much as they can, how they will eliminate, how they will destroy. The words they use, the terminology they use is terminology that when you sit down as a lawyer of international law and you classify it, you will see the genocidal intent in those statements. In the Rwanda situation, you will recall that people were being called cockroaches. You must stamp out the cockroaches. We must exterminate the cockroaches. And that was genocidal intent. That incited people to go and kill those that they regarded as being subhuman. Hitler himself would be bold enough to say, no Jew can be a citizen. Only a national comrade can be a citizen of German blood. That's genocidal intent. You are inciting people to go and hate others to the extent of killing, not just killing, exterminate others simply because of some perceived trait that sets them apart. And we've seen that a lot in the genocide that's going on right now in Gaza. Coming to the numbers, it's interesting that of the 21,000 plus people that have died, 70% of them are actually children and women. We know that when it comes to armed conflict, women do not participate much in that context. So to then have such a high casualty of women and children, 70% women and children out of the 21,000 is a lot. It tells you that unless the situation is arrested, humanity is going back to the days of Hitler. Humanity is going back to the days when we had the so-called World War II, which was not, in any case, global in its nature, but we had it and it was called that. So if we're not going to arrest this, we're going back to that situation. And like I said, we already have the laws, we already have the obligations. We are not in 1947, we're not in 1945. We're in 2024, the laws are there, the laws have been violated. We do not have to wait until 1 million people are killed. It's too much. for 1 million people to be killed and humanity does not intervene. When they intervened and they set up tribunals to try Hitler and company, they said that their crimes shocked the conscience of humankind. Why is humankind not shocked today when it was shocked so many years ago? What has changed? So we need to be shocked by the 21,000, particularly the fact that these are women and children. How can 5-year-olds fight in a war? The law for is clear. Those who are not participating in hostilities are protected by customary international law. They are not supposed to be touched. They are not combatants. They are not participating in hostilities. Unless you are telling me that those children were carrying AK-47s and dushkas and shooting everywhere, which is impossible.
Because it would be interesting, when you say that, Prof, particularly around, for example, the shooting of the refugee camp, the hospitals, the mosques, so many civilian property that's been subjected to attack for no reason whatsoever. And that's very interesting. But Prof, the question is this: is South Africa, at least diplomatically, not punching or trying to punch above its weight? Are we not perhaps going to compromise ourselves with this latest move that the government has taken, and particularly the economy side of issues?
That's an interesting one. Like I said in the beginning, the national interest, South Africa is a national interest in this. We would like to believe South Africa knows what it is doing diplomatically. And if you look at the region in Africa, South Africa is a heavyweight, both politically and economically. If South Africa was to keep quiet, who else would speak up and speak up with vigor and speak up with gravitas from our region, from our continent? It then remains an obligation upon South Africa as a member of the international community, as a leader in the region, to speak vociferously on this issue, because many countries have spoken. It's one thing to speak and be quoted by different media houses. It's one thing to send a note verbal via the diplomatic channels, but it's another to actually invoke the international criminal system, to invoke the international criminal, to invoke the systems of the International Court of Justice. I would like to believe that South Africa knows what it is doing. It knows the repercussions. But if we are keen on ensuring a reform of the international criminal justice system, then if we're keen on ensuring a reform of the international criminal justice, or reforming actually the global governance system, the UN and so forth, then we need voices such as South Africa's pushing, ferociously as they are doing, to say, if the UN Security Council, from which we are prevented from participating as a permanent member, are going to be quiet, there are other systems we can use to hold accountable both the members of the UN Security Council and the members of the United Nations themselves, such as Israel, who are now accused of perpetrating crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide.
Now, Prof, thank you very much for indicating that. But Prof, you've indicated before that there was, I think, an attempt by Israel to be an observer member at the AU. What do you make of the silence of the African Union on this serious issue?
Yeah, the problem with international relations or international politics is that even silence itself is a statement. It's not innocent at all. You would expect, there are countries like Malawi and so forth that were sending people to go and fight there. Perhaps you would expect them to have a voice, but then again, you think maybe they don't have a voice because South Africa's voice is now destabilizing some economic interest of theirs, because those that they're sending there to fight are going to be paid, and if they are paid, they will have to pay taxes somewhere. And also it alleviates the unemployment burden in that country. And here comes South Africa meddling in their affairs, so to speak, by now antagonizing Israel. And yet they thought here's a chance for our boys who are unemployed and bored to go and kill some people in Israel and get paid for that. And South Africa is now throwing a stone in the mix and messing things up. So the silence is actually loud. It's deafening. The silence of the AU is deafening. It's very loud, especially given that Israel itself has shown interest in the AU. And it took some of the Arab countries pushing back and some progressive African countries also pushing back and saying, no, we don't want you here. You will not be a member. You will not be granted observer status. You will add no value to African affairs. Get out. So you would expect the African Union to have a voice. But then again, maybe what we're calling for at the UN level, saying we need to reform the UN, maybe we need to reform the African Union as well.
Prof, let me take an opportunity. Let's say tomorrow you get, once in a lifetime opportunity to address the sitting of the African Union. What would you want to say in light of these challenges or the silence that we're talking about?
All right. Before I answer that question, Advocate, something came to my mind. And if I forget the question you posed, please draw me back to it. The action or the application of South Africa before the ICJ, the interesting thing about it for me is this, the invocation of interim measures.
Yes.
And a student of international law would understand interim measures. In other words, South Africa is going to the ICJ alleging that there's a dispute, and this dispute flows from the violation of fundamental rights of individuals or citizens of Palestine. And it wants a particular order. But while the matter is ongoing, because the matter can take a long time, to avoid any further harm, can the court issue an order regarding interim measures? In other words, issue an order that says cease hostilities, stop barricading people, stop killing children, stop doing everything.
Would you like to know where your loved one is? Simple. Add their phone number.
Those interim measures are critical because they allow this litigation to go on while there's an order that's operative that says to the offending state, do not kill any more people until we finalize this court. So for me, that stands out. So that's the other value add of the South African filing before the ICJ. That's the value that we're adding to the Republic to say, we want an international legal platform to pronounce on the situation in Gaza and to issue a directive that must then be respected by the Israeli government. But coming to your question, assuming I was before the AU right now, what would I say? That's a tough one. Okay, that's a tough one. I think first and foremost, the issue of reforming the AU itself would be at the forefront of my talk with the AU. There is definitely a need to reform the AU. We cannot be this silent when just across the Red Sea, things are happening. Just across from our territory, things are happening. And they are affecting us. They're affecting us as Africans, but we're quiet as the African Union. So a reform of the African Union. But also I would urge the African Union itself to also push for the reform of the United Nations.
Yes.
When they came together in the late 40s, the five of them, China, Russia, US, France, UK, to form the permanent 5 members of the United Nations, they gave them powers that we can never take away. They created a club that can always tell us what to do and what not to do. That cannot be. Yes, the US is paying more in terms of membership fees of the UN, but that's neither here nor there. I believe that if we are given equal participation in this instance, we too can actually pay our dues. And it's not actually a question of financial payments. It's a question of just bullying by the big 5. And that needs to be reformed. So the UN reforms would be the next thing that I would touch on. Because the lack of UN reforms are part of the reason why we're where we are today. The US will never condemn Israel for what it has done. They would keep calling for a 2-state solution, knowing very well that that horse bolted from the stable a long time ago. You cannot occupy a territory, forcefully introduce a different species into the territory and then say, let there be a two-state solution. Who will be the occupants of those two territories? It's too late. You've already been building settlements after settlement after settlement. You can no longer talk about a two-state solution. It's too late for that. But the other thing would be to go back to the basics, to say to humanity, where is Ubuntu? Atrocities or war crimes do not suddenly become more dire, more gory, simply because the putative victims are blue-eyed. We saw that in Ukraine. Some journalists from the EU trying to appeal to the world and saying, people are dying here. It's a catastrophe everywhere. There's blood everywhere. These are Christian people. They are blue-eyed like us. And I just read Hitler from those words.
Yeah.
Because he is a journalist at a global news outlet saying the one reason for intervening is that these people are blue-eyed. If they're not blue-eyed, don't intervene. And we know that that's a Hitlerian type of mentality because Hitler was also obsessed with that nonsense. And we're seeing it unfold today as a measurement of when and how, or if at all, to intervene. So those are some of the things that we would talk about. And then I would also, ask states to remember why we formed the AU and why we formed the UN. That's said in the 1940s, 1945, thereabouts, that never again. This must never happen. And we made the laws. The laws were made, but we are not willing to uphold them. The laws are there now. If we could prosecute Hitler, who had, in a context where there were no laws regulating his conduct, why are we unable to prosecute individuals who are patently violating laws which have existed for over 70 years? Why is it so hard for us? Is it because they're not blue-eyed? As the Euro thinking goes, we need to do an introspection. Those are some of the things I would talk about. And then I would urge progressive countries such as South Africa to say, you have a perpetrator of the violence in Israel holidaying in Cape Town, in Camps Bay. Prosecute them. They must not leave South Africa. They must be held before our courts and prosecuted for war crimes and crimes against humanity because they're enemies of humankind. And we'll be doing the Lord's work if we do that. So those are the lines along which my talk would go. Thank you, Advocate.
Yes, thank you very much, Prof. Prof, I don't know, maybe I must just add this. Actually, just a few hours ago, I was watching Al Jazeera and I realized that despite all these outcry that's been happening globally around the situation in Gaza, the American government has approved the sale of more weapons, to Israel. Artillery weapons to be used in that small area. What are your thoughts of that? It's just something that just came to mind now, actually. What do you say about America's role, actually, in this whole situation with Israel?
You see, Advocate, we know that the US is built on what we call the military-industrial complex. In other words, the more we fight, the more Americans get rich. Peace does not make money for them. Peace is not profitable. But if we fight, it makes more money. It is said that instead of de-escalating, we're seeing an escalation through the support that is there now. The US will use its economic power to facilitate this conflict. The US will also use its political power within the UN to facilitate this conflict. We continue to note the deafening silence of the US in condemning the happenings in Israel. So no matter what resolution the UN wanted to adopt, America would frustrate it. And let us not close our eyes to the carrot and stick approach to international relations, where smaller, less economic countries are given a carrot. Vote with us in this particular resolution, you will get more food aid. Or refuse, and you get the stick, which is the withdrawal of AGOA, the withdrawal of food aid. And because countries are not behaving like South Africa is, and banding together and maximizing their political muscle, then it's easy for the US to divide and control. Because if every one of these countries behaved just like the Republic has behaved right now, to say, I'm going to hold Israel accountable under its own international obligations, if countries were to band together and do that, then the carrot and stick approach would cease to be effective. It is effective simply because they are working in silos. They don't want, even as a collective, as an African Union, you can see the divisions there. That is why the African Union is deafeningly silent on this matter.
Prof, perhaps the last second question. From my observation, actually, it would seem that DECO is able to be very clear and articulate on the question of Israel and somehow miscommunicates or is unable to communicate on other situations that are of equal importance. For example, what's happening in Ethiopia, what's happening in the Sahel and elsewhere. What can you say about the way the department has been so brilliant in communicating the question of Israel, and what lessons can we as a country, as a people, as government learn from how they have handled the Israel question?
Look, you're touching on the Sahel issue, which is for me very decolonial in nature, and I appreciate the happenings there, and I wish we could have another talk of this nature around the Sahel region. And have more opinions coming in on that region. But if you look at our communication vis-a-vis the Sahel issue, vis-a-vis Mozambique, vis-a-vis Tigray, and so forth and so forth, we have been wishy-washy as a republic. We have been wishy-washy, and we need to actually own up to that. So if you see the comms that were coming out of DERCO regarding this particular issue, South Africa was, spirited and animated by this issue, and they were clear about the policy of the Republic in this regard, including, threats of actually withdrawing from the diplomatic ties that we have, and that's the highest form of communication and disdain that you can display as a country towards another country. If we could see that, but I don't know how many, the many different factors that could have contributed to that. But one of them could be, the ferociousness of the lobby behind what is happening there. If there was a lobby for the Mozambicans, if there was a lobby for citizens of the Sahel belt, if there was a lobby for victims in the Tigray region, you would actually possibly see DERCO speaking in similar terms as it is speaking now. So, but mine is to simply acknowledge and commend DERCO for being at least a little bit clearer on this issue than it has in the past. Because as citizens, we also don't want to be guessing what's the government thinking, what's the government stance, what's the government's way forward on this issue. On this one, it is clear. South Africa is willing to use the diplomatic channels, to use its political might, and to use the legal system, both the criminal justice system and the ICC and under the ICJ, to hold its counterpart Israel accountable. It's commendable. DERCO must continue to do that, and we must invite them to this platform when we next speak about the next issue that we're going to be speaking about. And I see on the chart, advocate, if I may, can your organization constantly educate the church and fraternity that intercedes for Israel to distinguish between Zionism and Judaism? Yes, people are speaking on the chart. I'm enjoying what I'm seeing there. Please do have another Zoom on Sahel, Ethiopia, etc. All these issues that you are bringing here, we will discuss them, and we will we'll invite everyone to come through and participate in the next iteration of our discussions. We'll try and involve the government as well in this regard, so that we have a more nuanced and a more value-packed discussion. But the first comment on the church is rather interesting. We need to have one of the leaders within the church fraternity to perhaps join us and articulate their position, because it does not add up that as a South African who suffered from the vicissitudes of apartheid, you would stand up and say, I stand with Israel. My God says I must pray for Israel, and forget that Israel is an apartheid state that hates everything which is not Israeli. It hates you even as you pray for it. It would kill you even as you pray for it. But you stand there and you say, it's my religious duty to actually be killed by the same Israeli state that I'm praying for. And maybe through that I will see heaven. So we must invite one of those religious leaders who are perpetrating this religious teaching to come and defend it on this platform. Thank you for those comments. And back to you, Advocate.
Prof, I just wanted perhaps to just going through the comments as well. There's one from Lucas Morena. He says, how soon are these referrals going to be heard, and what were more or less the prescribed timeline? One thing that's very clear is that the matter has been brought before the ICJ on an urgent application. So it's an urgent application. So they surely would apply their mind within the shortest period of time. I doubt we could be prescriptive in terms of saying exactly, 1 week, 2 weeks, or whenever. But the point is, it's an urgent application. The other issue is how effective are the outcomes of the ICC? Can you talk to the issue of enforceability? I think it's a point that you touched on when you spoke about, the veto power and the challenges with the international legal system. And I don't know if you want to add a few more thoughts on the effectiveness of the ICC on the enforceability aspect.
Enforceability, yes. Look, once the ICC issues an arrest warrant, it then becomes the obligation of every state to actually apprehend the perpetrators and bring them to justice. And under international law, we have what we call aut dedere aut judicare, or aut dedere aut punire. In other words, extradite or punish. When you have this person in your territory and he committed crimes in Israel, in Gaza, it's either your duty as a state is to either punish this person, or if you're not willing to punish, release him to go to another state which is requesting for him, so that state can punish him. So if we could go back to the basics, the laws are there. States must just be willing to enforce them. Punish or extradite. It's that clear. So if the ICC, because even if the ICC was to fail in this regard, even if the ICC was to investigate and come back and say, no Israeli was involved, South Africa on its own can still do its own investigations. Or if it gets even the evidence it requires, it can go ahead and prosecute those that are involved using its own domestic judicial systems. It is permitted to do so by customary international law and by other conventions such as the Genocide Convention to actually proceed in that direction.
Correct, Prof. Prof, there's a question by Ashraf Esop. He says, what steps can the South African government take against South African citizens serving in the IDF and the settler militia in Palestine?
The law in South Africa is clear on the issue of what we call mercenaries, soldiers of fortune. I am broke, I need money as fast as I can. I leave the Republic, I pick up my dushka and I start blowing people's heads off. And I get paid, I come back home, my children have a cake and Fanta, they're happy. They don't know they're eating blood money. The Republic frowns upon that. There are laws around it. You have to go through a particular committee which must vet your application to go and fight in a foreign armed conflict. Once that committee has determined your application, it takes it to the minister who must then endorse. If you don't get endorsed, then you can be prosecuted. Unfortunately, our law needs to be reformed. You cannot be giving people suspended sentences for this thing. You cannot be giving people fines of between 10,000 and 100,000 for this thing. It makes more sense to go and fight and get the money and come back and pay the fine, because the fine is so little compared to the money you'd be paid when you go and fight illegally like this. So the laws are there, but the laws need to be reformed to match the current needs of the time. That is the problem with our South African laws on mercenaries.
Thank you very much, Prof. Prof, perhaps I think at this juncture, it would be appropriate to take a few questions direct from members on the platform. I don't know if there are any takers, if they could help us manage the questions. Are there any questions? Are there any questions? Being once, go twice. I see a hand, Prof. I see a member.
Ahmed has a hand up.
Oh, is there somebody?
Yes, Ahmed, yes.
Yeah.
The floor is yours.
Okay, so yeah, what I want to ask is how effective is the ICJ? I think most wars are bankers' wars, and this war in Gaza seems like a gas heist and an oil fields heist, and we are speaking of almost 600 billion, and if you take the other oil fields, it's almost $1 trillion. This is a 140-year war, not just a 70-year war, because in 1907, there was about 60,000 farmers and they killed and their lands confiscated by Zionist terrorist groups. So my question, if these are bankers' wars and the bankers are also controlling the ICC and ICJ, what can we really expect from the outcome of the ICJ or these type of instruments being controlled by the bankers that controls the oil and controls the arms and everything?
All right. Thank you for the brilliant question. The takeaway from the ICJ, whatever pronouncement it makes, supposing it makes a positive pronouncement and finds that indeed there is genocide going on, is that even those bankers, if we then begin to trace their involvement and we can trace the dollars and where the dollars went, we can now begin to have a longer list of suspects that should be up for prosecution, either at the ICC or in the domestic courts of third states such as South Africa and other progressive states that we have. So we're creating a portfolio of evidence. We're creating step by step, we're beginning to build up to say there have been judicial pronouncements that this is a crime, that this is a violation of the Genocide Convention. And then we look at who are the people involved. It's not just the politicians. It's not just the military generals. It is also the bankers. It is also American companies which are benefiting from the oil heist that is happening there. So when we begin now to prosecute an American sitting in New York will now have an arrest warrant issued against him by a court in Johannesburg because he's wanted for his part in or for financing the war in Israel. We can then begin in countries where we have progressive justice systems. We can begin to label them as terrorists and put them on the terrorist list so that they have a no-fly flag against their names, so that they have warrants outstanding against their names. So we build bit by bit. So if any pronouncement coming from the ICJ assists in that regard, I hope I've handled that question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Prof.
You're welcome. I see Stanley's hand is up as well.
Any other further takers?
I have a smaller or shorter question. We've actually witnessed the murder or the killing of over 68 journalists in Gaza presently. What is the standing of the international criminal law of justice when it comes to the protection of journalists during wartime?
Thanks, Stanley. You are touching on a very important point, which we have seen it play itself out in Gaza, and it's very unfortunate. The law of war is clear on the issue of distinction, that when you conduct hostilities, when you shoot your gun, you don't fire indiscriminately. You must distinguish between a combatant and a non-combatant. Aid workers, people belonging to the ICRC, what is called the Red Cross, gift of the givers, that type of scenario. People who are bringing health facilities to the people are not supposed to be harmed. They are protected by the Geneva Convention and their protocols. They are protected by international customary law. They are protected by the law of war. When you hit a journalist or when you harm a journalist, just as when you harm a health worker, ambulances and so forth, you are committing what is called a war crime, and you are liable to be prosecuted at the end of those hostilities. So what we have seen in the Gaza situation happening, schools, hospitals, journalists being killed, being bombarded, and all those practitioners being killed, is an incident of war crimes, which is why we're calling for the involvement of the ICC, and which is why we're calling for the ICJ to proclaim and pronounce on this matter before it, so that we can then move forward and prosecute those involved. So to cut the long story short, the killing of journalists violates the law of war. It is one of the highest crimes in international law. In the law of war, it is to be frowned upon, and perpetrators are to be punished accordingly.
Prof, I will take one more question, and then I think I must give you a rest. We need to close the session. Who is the lucky taker? Last question. Any last question? Any hands? Going once, going twice, and we are done. Prof, last on my side, sir, thank you very much from Apron, and the discussion has been amazing. The audiences, especially the chat, has been fantastic. And one thing that I just saw now lately on the chat is that members are calling for essentially a short course on this topic, because it is so rich. I think it's something that Apron should consider to create a short course in dealing with this. But also I'd like to thank Lohap for participating, Prof. But where I am, Prof, actually also, I'm in a studio of Rehailo Funeral Homes, all the way in Twatwa for Kitadichaba. So even business people are supporting our initiatives, and we'd like to thank Dr. Moekoa for assisting us with the studio. We hopefully will make more use of this studio in future when dealing with such important issues. Hopefully he's that generous. But having said that, Prof, my final words are this, and they come from the preamble essentially of the Rome Statute. And it says the most serious crimes of concern to the international community shall not go unpunished, or should not go unpunished. So what the government of the Republic of South Africa is doing is a great issue. It's a service to humanity, and it ought to be a good example for the entire continent to follow, and all other peace-loving citizens and states of the world, Prof. Thank you for this opportunity. And having said that, sir, you can go and rest, sir. We appreciate you. We appreciate Apron, sir. Having said that, I'm out.
Thank you, Advocate, and thank you to everyone who came through. We know it's the holiday season. You set aside time to be with us. You could be with your families. We really appreciate, and we hope to see you in the future on discussions on this platform. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, everybody. Have a good one.
Cheers.
And
Thank
if they
you so
want
much.
to invite Apron, Prof, to the individual platforms, they are
Yes.
certainly able to send an invite. I
Yes.
see advocates at various chambers there. They can certainly send an invite, and we can educate some of their members on these important issues.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
you.
And have a lovely
Thank you,
end
guys.
of 2023.